Content warning. This story contains references to infidelity, corporate manipulation, and implied violent acts. Scenes of harm are described with restraint. She saw the kiss before she understood what it would cost her. It arrived like a photograph caught in motion. The slow, casual incline of two bodies under a chandelier. The curve of Ethan Hayes' jaw as he leaned in. The practiced smile of Adeline Row as she met him halfway. The hotel balcony was framed in glass, the city at their feet. Lily had thought she was watching a rehearsal, two public figures, a staged intimacy for cameras. Then Ethan's hand slid along Adeline's back, and something in Lily folded inward, the world settling into an unfamiliar wrongness. For a second she believed the doors between them would simply close and the moment would be contained, private, forgettable. She had been married to a man who managed impressions for a living. Ethan Hayes kept storms under glossy lids. He ran Hayes Group with a hand that never trembled in public. Reputation was his oxygen. She had learned to read the machinery behind his calm, the press briefings, the carefully timed apologies, the polished faces that guarded their private life like a vault. But she had not learned to read the way his body lit up for other women. She watched them the way you watch a movie you once loved and now find detached of meaning. His laugh with Adeline was the laugh he'd used in boardrooms, in photographs, in the warm videos for charity drives. And yet when it hit her, when the realization landed like a stone in her palm, there was a physical jolt. The champagne glass in her hand tightened until the stem dug into her fingers. Her phone, which had been resting in the clutch at her side, angled so she could see the screen bright and trembling. She did not take a picture. She didn't need to. Her memory was a shutter that refused to close. They came back into the ballroom like nothing had happened. Ethan's face was a practiced mask. He greeted guests with a kindness that never touched his eyes. Adeline, radiant in the way an actress is trained to be luminous, moved through the room with a flurry of admirers. The gala carried on, the same strings, the same laughter. Lily could have made a choice in that moment to bury the image, to let the night be what it had always been. Another event, another photograph. But betrayal is a grammar that rewrites priorities. She excused herself to the restroom, locked herself in a stall, and called her lawyer. The divorce papers were not an act of cruelty, they were a compass. Filing was the first scalpel cut into the myth of the Hayes household. It was precise, it was public. It was a decision that surprised even Lily with its clarity. In the 2 days that followed, Ethan's reaction threaded between denial and a strange, distracted contrition. He texted her with phrases that had been rehearsed in PR training. Complicated. We need privacy. This is not what it looks like. Once, at the edge of the living room where family photos lined the mantel, he stood so close she could smell the citrus scent he wore, and for a moment she searched his face for the man who had promised her a lifetime. There was guilt there, but it was mixed with calculation. He kept saying, half to himself, "We can manage this." Lily did not want to manage anything. She wanted truth. The first shock cleared, and the second began to show its edges. The footage of the balcony had no angle that captured what she had seen. The surveillance tapes from the event's security company had gaps. Someone had labeled files as corrupt or empty, and the timeline around the balcony was blurred as if wiped by a deliberate hand. When Lily asked Ethan for the hotel's surveillance backup, he gave her a lawyer, a soft voice that promised to handle it discreetly. He suggested going private, settle quietly, keep their life intact for the children in their social circle, for Grandfather Hayes, who prized reputation like a relic. She had expected resistance. She had not expected the blankness of 1,000 small erasures. The staff who couldn't recall seeing a camera on the balcony. The PR officer who insisted the newsletter story be moved to tomorrow. The IT director who referred her to a firewall she had no reason to navigate. The silence of those files felt like an accusation. There was, she realized, a hierarchy of secrets, and she had been titled outside it. "Why would someone delete footage?" she asked Leo, the Hayes Group security liaison who had worked with Ethan for years and avoided eye contact when she demanded answers. Leo's jaw tightened. "Sometimes, Miss Hayes, the room for mistakes is limited. You know how it is at the top?" At the top, the phrase was both explanation and dismissal. It should have been simple: private hurt, private separation. But the marriage to Ethan Hayes was wrapped in 100 other things: control of a company, a philanthropic arm, a board that watched for tremors in stock price, a family whose very being was a brand. When Lily filed, she cut a thread that ran through all of them. And because the thread had been under tension for years, the cut did more than sever. It unspooled. If the first act was the personal rupture, the second was the public ripple. Within 48 hours of the filing, carefully phrased statements began to appear. An anonymous tip to a gossip column implied Lily's personal fragility and overreaching. Adeline's team, managers and publicists with the sort of practiced ferocity that disguises panic, issued a statement about respect for privacy and the dangers of rumor. Ethan held a brief press appearance announcing that his family would be taking private time, a phrase that read like a curtain. Lily expected spin. What she didn't expect were the edges of darker things pushing up through the polish. A comment thread under a charity photo that included Adeline devolved into threats. A package, anonymous but heavy enough to make her hands shake, was left at the service entrance of her office. It contained nothing but a single photograph, blurred but intimate. Ethan and Adeline in a taxi the week before, laughing, her hand resting on his knee. Someone had started cataloging her life, collecting points of intimacy and trading them as currency. She could have walked away, let the market of stories close over her. Instead, the moment the image of Ethan with Adeline saturated her mind, she felt an old familiar anger. The same precise indignation that had fueled years of work as a creative director. She had been responsible for campaigns that revealed truths about brands. She knew how to find the seams in a machine. If someone was manipulating the narrative of her life, she would pull the stitch. Her first source was small and discreet. An ex-IT consultant named Marco, who had been let go from Hayes Group 2 years earlier, under circumstances Lily suspected were engineered. He was thin, sudden, the kind of man who existed half in the world of servers and half in the world of excuses. He met her in a coffee shop with industrial coffee and a playlist of soft jazz. "Backups are messy," Marco said. "People like Julian. If Julian asked for a file, it would probably disappear, not destroyed, relabeled, moved." He tapped the edge of a sugar packet, avoiding her eyes like someone handling a live wire. Julian Hayes. The name landed like a shard. Julian was Ethan's cousin, a lesser executive with the sort of hunger that made him shuffle toward influence. Whoever Julian was in public, whatever smiles he wore in family photos, whispered accounts painted him as a quiet architect who didn't mind getting his hands dirty. "Do you have anything that points to Adeline?" Lily asked, leaning forward until the table creaked. Marco's eyes flicked up, then away. "There are call logs, travel itineraries, a VIP list, but the eyes of it? If you're talking surveillance that shows what happened on the balcony, that one is gone, or it's been moved. There is, though, always the human element. Screenshots, phones, people who save things. Screenshot." The word felt ordinary and explosive. In the world of evidence, a screenshot was a small thing that could not be rewritten. People saved what they wanted to remember. People missed the gravity of what they stored until later. "Find me," Lily said simply. "There's something else," Marco added, as if he had been saving his real confession like a second shot of espresso. 3 years ago, remember the gala at the harbor? There was a disturbance. Someone said the drinks were tampered with. There was an accident later that night. Mr. Hayes' father was in the car. People said it was a tragedy. Then the footage ended up, he slid his hand through the air. You know how it goes. 3 years earlier. 3 years earlier, the Hayeses had hosted a philanthropic gala in a tented pavilion on the harbor. Lily had been new to the family's inner circle, young enough to still believe that charity could change the shape of a city, old enough to know that gifts always carried an invoice of expectation. Ethan had given a speech that night about legacy and obligation. Someone had spiked a round of drinks. The archive video from the evening faltered. A camera by the bar that had been at an angle to catch the room, later showing static. Later that night, a car had swerved off a rain-slicked road. Lily's father had been driving. The police had ruled it an accident. The story in every paper called it a tragic misfortune. The Hayes family had set up funds, delivered kind words, offered condolences. Lily had been the one to speak at the funeral, soft words for a private man. And then the city moved on. But she had always noticed small discrepancies, a line on a timeline that didn't add, a shifted name in the guest list, a memory of her father leaving the tent earlier than the log said. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked Marco in the coffee shop. "Because it's connected," Marco said. "Whoever had the motive to keep you quiet then, it wouldn't surprise me if they're the same people picking up scraps now." He gave her an address of a storage unit registered in a shell company under Julian's name. It was a mundane breath of leaden paper. A postal receipt, a rent ledger, nothing that screamed conspiracy. But it offered a place to start. Evidence, Marco reminded her, always started as something small. An envelope, a pair of shoes, a receipt for a motel room. Lily's decision to look was both rational and personal. Ethan's betrayal had been the spark. The rest was tinder. She began to sort her grief into tasks. She asked for the hotel's records for the night of the balcony. She scoured Ethan's calendar, noting the times he had been unavailable. She combed philanthropic emails for names that repeated in the margins of event planning. In the bedroom of their house, the one with the tall windows and city view, she sat with a notebook and wrote down questions like a litany. Who benefits? Who lied? Who covers up? Ethan watched her with a face that was at times tender and at times baffled. There were moments, rare, sharp, when the old intimacy appeared. A shared joke over morning coffee, a furtive touch on the back of her hand at a family dinner. Those moments made her anger worse because they were evidence that any of this could have been stopped earlier. But he also argued, once in the study, warmed by lamplight, that filing for divorce was reckless, that it would blow up not only his career but her footing in the city. "Think about grandfather," he said, and the word think carried the weight he always used to steady others. Grandfather Hayes, the family patriarch, had watched the business for decades. He was fragile in body and iron in will. His downturn after Lily filed was swift and terrifying in a way that felt like collateral damage. A few weeks into the separation proceedings, he fell ill. The doctors called it a stress-related decline. Lily suspected the same pressure she had set loose. Family members arrived, quiet and polished, murmuring about stamina and legacies. Ethan, who had always been the picture of control, suddenly looked smaller in front of the hospital bed. He did not stop her from seeing grandfather, but there were times when he lingered by the doorway as if deciding whether to step in. The press smelled blood in the water. An Instagram story from a fan of Adeline's, an exuberant, naive account of love and fandom, ignited message boards. Lily's name trended under hashtags she did not recognize. Hate emails arrived in the middle of the night. One anonymous commenter, insisting they were a concerned insider, claimed Lily's grief over her father's accident had been handled in ways the public did not know. The comment implied others had protected her from painful truths by softening a narrative. Lily's chest tightened. When had truth been curated in such a way that the truth of someone's life could be altered without their knowledge? She began to see patterns where none had been visible before. Adeline's name showed up in travel itineraries that matched the nights of certain incidents, payments in bank statements with a description that read consulting, but which correlated to times when a witness later said Adeline had been in private with Ethan. A voicemail from a PR associate implied a hush payment. Small arithmetic added up to suspicion. Lily's investigation was a lonely thing at first. She moved in a network of half-trusts. Sean Young, an actor with a history that tied him to Adeline's early career, was the type of person who exists in both costume and self. He had been a flame, the one who had once claimed Adeline's rehearsed attention and then been discarded. She found him in a rehearsal room in a theater that smelled of dust and stage glue. "Why would Adeline want to be protected?" he asked when Lily asked him about the night of the gala 3 years earlier. He rubbed his thumb across the edge of a cigarette before remembering he had quit. "Because she gains. Because someone molds her into an asset. Actresses, some of them, are useful assets. They say things publicly, but privately they eat their words. There are people who make careers the way others make bread." Sean's frame of reference was small and intimate. Backstage whispers, actors who slept on couches, managers who whispered instructions. He offered Lily a sliver of Adeline's past, a motel receipt, A photograph where Adeline and a man Lily couldn't immediately identify left a downtown bar. It was nothing definitive. It was, as Marco had said, human evidence. Meanwhile, in boardrooms, Ethan was negotiating his own whispers. At first he hovered between denial and appeasement. Protect Adeline to maintain the coalition she represented, investors who adored her charity work, sponsors who saw her as an extension of the brand. His argument was not personal in its core. It was strategic. If he stood with Adeline, he could contain the narrative. If he abandoned her, Julian might swoop in. Julian with his dry humor and his ability to twist sympathy into leverage. Ethan's vacillation revealed him rather than shrouded him. There were nights he sat across from Lily at the kitchen table and tried to explain. She's been in my life more than you know. There are arrangements, he faltered, searching for a word. Obligations? Sometimes you love who you protect. It's not always who you are with. The sentence was both admission and evasion. Lily had been a partner in the work of building an empire and in the private rituals of their home. To hear him describe protection as something that could be externalized, assigned to an actress, was a knife. There were other signs that the Hayes machine, usually so orchestrated, was exerting force. A statement from Hayes Group's PR team floated in her inbox. They'd be supporting all parties through this difficult time. It was the kind of document that opened and closed warm pits of shame. It read as if their brand's humanity had been captured and bottled. But under the bland words, something else moved. The legal team asked Lily to sign confidentiality agreements. Lawyers politely reminded her of non-disparagement clauses she had once agreed to in their prenuptial arrangements. It was as if the architecture of their life was shaped to prevent her from telling the story she had just seen with her own eyes. She signed nothing. Instead, she began to collect what she could. Records from the hotel, a few grainy photos taken by guests that showed Ethan and Adeline too close for comfort, an email chain between Julian and a PR manager that suggested a cleanup of embarrassing content. The more she assembled, the more the pattern stank of intentionality. It was not simply a private infidelity, it was a cultivated relationship with the capacity to be wielded. When she went public with the divorce filing, she braced for a flurry of attacks, calls in the night, ghosted columns, the murmured pity of mutual friends. The first wave was manageable. She had friends who came with wine and silence, parents who called with a language of concern. But the second wave hit in a way she had not expected. A protest outside the Hayes Group headquarters, organized by an anonymous online collective that praised Adeline and accused Lily of silencing a woman. The chant was ironic and cruel in equal measure. At the protest, a woman in a hand-painted sign yelled that "Love is messy," and a half-dozen men with muscle and masks hovered near the edge of the crowd. A bottle shattered somewhere unseen. Little things accumulated. A smear of lipstick on a commuter bench, a smear campaign unfounded but viral. Someone tried to throw a concoction toward Adeline's car as she left an event. The bottle missed and hit the pavement, the substance fizzing into smoke that smelled of chemicals. No one was hurt, but the image spread like wildfire. The word acid appeared, whispered, before the journalists corrected themselves, before the police announced it was an attempted assault and not a successful one. It was the kind of violence that, even when it missed flesh, scorched people's nerves. Lily stayed away from the events that followed. She watched recordings, the same way she watched Ethan's face. She learned how to read the pauses. She watched board meetings where Julian smiled a little too widely, and where Ethan moved like a man trying to stitch a wound that refused to heal. She made a choice. She would not be silenced into a neat label. She would pull at the threads and see where they led. The first true advance was a small, almost trivial thing. A young assistant at the magazine where she freelanced had saved a screenshot from a late-night thread. In it, someone had posted a picture of Adeline leaving a private suite with a man whose profile was obscured. The metadata on the photo was gone, stripped by someone competent. But in the bottom corner was a tiny watermark, a logo of a private security firm that was contracted to Hayes Group on occasion. That watermark was a breadcrumb. Lily took it as an invitation. She hired a private investigator with firm hands and a quiet voice. The PI, Maria, moved through the city's underbelly with the calm of someone who had seen how often public images were manipulations. Maria found a backup, a phone that had been turned into a pawnshop by someone who later came forward with a story of guilt. The phone had belonged to a security guard, someone who had been quietly sacked after the Harbor Gala. On it was a photo from the balcony, the exact frame Lily had seen. The image was grainy, cropped, imperfect, but it captured Ethan and Adeline in an embrace, the world of the city blurred behind them. Lily held the printout of the photo like a talisman. It was small and ordinary, and it was the first piece of the story that could not be erased by corporate spin. She printed copies. She sent one to Marco. She gave a copy to Maria to analyze for timestamps. There were consequences the moment the photograph left her hands. Julian, in his way, began to swarm. He called Ethan twice on the same day and left messages that were thinly veiled threats. "You should be careful," Julian said in one voicemail. "There are people who can make things difficult." The implication was clear. Julian's ambition had teeth, and he had learned to use them. Ethan's response to the photo was not what Lily expected. He did not explode in anger or plead for forgiveness on a phone call. Instead, he asked to meet, and when they sat across from each other the next morning in a hotel that smelled of lemon and linen, his expression had a new weariness to it. "I don't want a war," he said softly. "We can settle this. For the children, for grandfather, for the company. People will understand. They always do." "People will also understand the truth," Lily answered, "and they deserve to." He looked at her then, like he had looked at her the first time he fell in love with her, in a way that catalogued possibility and then prioritized his next move. "You know how fragile everything is," he said. "If this goes public, it's not just my career. Julian will take advantage. He will use your publicity to launch himself." She recognized the calculus. Julian's name surfaced again, the skeleton she had seen in whispers. If Ethan stayed with Adeline, Julian could be contained, his appetite managed by the illusion of generation succession. If Ethan left Adeline exposed, Julian could press an advantage at the board. The truth was not a neutral thing here. It was a lever that could set forces moving. Lily's reply was a simple recalibration of her aim. "I'm not here to play your games," she said. "I'm here to find out who killed my father." Ethan's face went white. For a beat, something like horror crossed him. "Lily," he began, but the word died on his tongue. He had always known, in the margins of meetings and in private conversations, the family's shadowed inventory. He had not moved to interfere with the police files in the way Julian might. He had protected sometimes with money. He had sometimes buried an email or two. What he had not done was murder. That was an accusation that weighed differently on him. "You suspect someone did," he said finally. "You think that car?" "I think someone made it easier for them to get away with things," Lily answered. "And I think Adeline isn't just a lover. I think she's been part of something manufactured. I think Julian has been placing pieces on the board for years." He stood then, a man trying to maintain a center. "Be careful," he said. "There are things you don't know, things you shouldn't open." The warning was useless to Lily. She had already decided. The photograph in her hand was a small, ordinary vindication. It gave her courage. It gave her a plan. After the meeting, she put the copy in an envelope and drove to a private news producer she trusted, someone who didn't blink at powerful names and who knew how to protect sources. She left the envelope, breath fogging on the glass of a single lamp-lit window. In return, the producer sent back a line of text that read, "If you're going to do this, be methodical." The text was both advice and assignment. That method was the rhythm Lily adopted. Nights she pored over statements and schedules. Days she called witnesses and asked them to remember small things. The color of a coat, the time of a laugh, the phrase someone had used in passing. Memory is an unreliable ledger, but it has patterns. People misremember details but rarely the shape of a thing. The more she pushed, the more oddities surfaced. A hospital log that misplaced times, a receptionist who could not recall a face, a PR intern who remembered Julian's insistence that certain footage be handled. The city's appetite for scandal is a heat-seeking thing. A rumor of the Hayes family in trouble is a siren that calls for proximity. But it wasn't until the gala's next iteration, the one held in honor of Grandfather Hayes's philanthropic wing, that the whole thing became undeniable. The charity event was a study in veneer, crystal and silk, lot numbers slotted to benefit the right hearts, speeches that ranged from genuine to rote. Adeline was scheduled to appear as a guest of honor. Julian would be there. Ethan would stand at the podium and smile. Lily nearly did not go. She had a prenuptial agreement and a strategy. There was a restraining clause in place, but she wanted the momentum. She wanted a chance to speak truth into a room where people were accustomed to believing in stories. She wanted to be seen. She arrived in a dress that felt armor, its simplicity winding down the city lights with an inconspicuous elegance. Cameras found her in a way she had not expected. Reporters clustered like polite wasps, microphones extended. Someone tried to bait her into saying things she wasn't ready to say. She kept calm. She let their questions be absorbed by the muscle of her control. In the foyer, she felt the weight of eyes. On the far side of the room, Ethan stood with Adeline, laughing as if at a private joke. Julian watched them both with a calm that seemed to be a commodity he saved for crises. Lily walked through the room with her head high. People whispered. She catalogued faces. She watched Julian use a phone to call someone and saw him tuck it away as if it were evidence of his own heat. When the auction began and the chandelier light turned everything gold, she planned to make a small speech about transparency and philanthropy, a neutral topic that would allow her to signal that she would not be stopped. The moment did not go as planned. Halfway through her sentences, a woman in the mezzanine caused a commotion. The room shifted. A sound like a slosh echoed. Someone shouted. The gasps were not only for the interruption, but for the small cascade that followed. A bottle flung from the balcony hit the polished marble and shattered. Panic moved like a current. People grabbed themselves and their coats. Children were ushered behind pillars. Cameras swung away. Someone, anonymous, faceless, had attempted to mar the night. Adeline's team insisted later that it had been a lone agitator. The newspapers called it an unfortunate incident. Lily knew better. This was escalation. Julian's plan, if it was his, was beginning to burn its edges. The protesters were more organized than they had been before. The threats were coming from multiple directions. The small, careful world Lily had once inhabited, made of board meetings and curated lives, was now an amphitheater. After the chaos, when the gala's hosts apologized and the doors closed early, Lily found a message taped under a seat where she had been sitting. It was a Polaroid, smeared at the edges, with a hand-drawn X over her face. On the back someone had written, with a child's uneven script, "Stop digging." It was the first time a threat became personal. The words were almost quaint, and therefore all the more chilling. Someone was watching her. Someone wanted her to stop. She did not. If this story is holding you, if the way a perfect life unthreads into raw and dangerous seams captivates you, then stay, like and subscribe for the whole unraveling. There are more parts to this that cannot be known without looking deeper. After the gala, Lily's nights were sleepless. She started carrying the photograph of Ethan and Adeline in the inside pocket of her coat. It was a small, ordinary talisman against the erasure she'd seen in surveillance files. Marco found a ledger. An invoice for a payment to Wayne Hill, labeled Security Consulting, dated the week after the Harbor Gala 3 years prior. Wayne Hill was a name that carried a different kind of weight. He had worked in the shadow economy of the city's muscle, a man rumored to have done what the system did not want to be seen doing. Lily's pulse went slow when she read the ledger. A payment to Wayne Hill could mean many things. It could mean, as Julian's enemies later whispered, a contract signed in ledger lines. It could also mean nothing legal at all, just a man paid for a night's service. But when she cross-referenced the dates with the night her father had died and with the gaps in surveillance footage, the lines began to look less like coincidences and more like a map. She called Maria and told her to chase Wayne Hill's records, CPAP machine purchases, night shift logs, a transient motel where he had once been seen, any public document that could tie his presence to a place and a time. Maria had a way of staying cool. "If we tie him to a night," she said, "we get the first ring." The first ring came in the form of a witness. An older woman who had once worked as a caterer at the Harbor Gala remembered seeing Wayne Hill at the back of the tent, talking to a short man with a grey tie. She remembered because the man had given her an extra tip and then walked away without looking back. Her memory was fogged by years of plates and heat, but it was consistent. She swore she had seen the man near the bar where drinks later went wrong. Evidence moved like water, seeping into cracks, staining, then pooling where gravity allowed. Lily collected these stains, phone metadata, witness statements, invoices. Each one looked like a pebble in a stream, small alone but capable of widening the channel if enough stones were gathered. Ethan's reaction became more complex. Sometimes he was furious, sometimes distant. Once, while they were both in the house she had thought of as theirs, he sat across from her and said, "If Julian is involved in anything illegal, I will burn him down." He said it with a ferocity that suggested he might, for once, mean what he said. But his eyes flicked to the window, as if someone might be listening in the air itself. Julian's shadow moved differently. He did not rage. He watched and smiled in a way that could mean anything: amusement, disdain, calculation. People who met him noticed the economy of his motion. He ordered a wrong done and left the heavy lifting to others. The weeks widened. Lily's list of leads grew. So did the threats. A man in a windbreaker followed her to a parking garage and waited until she was in the elevator to tap on her car. When she reported it, Leo shrugged and said they'd increase security. Increased security meant a guard posted at her door who kept an eye but did not always stand between her and the city's brutality. Then, when she least expected it, the thread that had been stitched for years began to pull with sudden velocity. Maria called one morning with an address. A storage unit in the industrial stretch south of the river that matched Marco's earlier tip. Maria had a key acquired by dexterity and money. She found, among damp boxes and folded linens, a small hard drive wrapped in plastic. The label had Julian's initials. Inside were files, event schedules, invoices, an old hospital discharge sheet with a timestamp that did not match public records. There were videos, some corrupted, some intact. One of them was short, grainy, and shot from a phone at the Harbor Gala 3 years prior. It showed a man at the bar with a gray tie, his back to the camera. Someone moved the camera, and in the shudder of the phone's motion, the security pamphlet for the night moved into frame, showing names that had been considered private. Lily felt, the way one feels wind before rain, a lift in the air. The hard drive was not an indictment in itself. It was, however, a vector. It suggested coordination. It suggested that the funeral, the statements, the funds that had been set up, a neat package of grief, might be bound to a different ledger. She called Ethan. She told him what she had found, and his voice on the line was a low thing, equal parts relief and fear. "We have to be careful," he said. "If this gets out, Julian will—" "I know what he'll do," Lily interrupted. "I know the kind of calculus he uses." He was silent for a long time. "If you push this, know what you're doing. People will get hurt." Lily's answer was the same as always. "People have already been hurt," she said. "I'm tired of protecting them by pretending it didn't happen." When she hung up, she felt a small victory and a small dread. The hard drive's files glinted like proof under a microscope waiting for scrutiny. But small victories have a way of inviting violence. They show corners to those who would rather remain in the dark. Later that day, as rain fell in thick citywide sheets, a sedan pulled up outside Lily's apartment. A man with a neutral face left a single envelope in her mailbox. Inside, a single sheet of paper. A newspaper clipping from years ago about the accident that had killed her father, with a pen circle around a phrase in the article. Someone had left a message without writing words. She understood it as a provocation. It was a threat without a body. And in the house she once shared with Ethan, a small space where they had argued and reconciled and shared breakfasts, the photograph of Ethan and Adeline sat in the pocket of her coat, a small, ordinary relic that had the potential to do more than old hurt. It was a seed. It had been planted in soil that had been tended for years by people who knew how to make things disappear. If she had the courage to pull at the root, she might be able to unearth what lay beneath. She did not yet know how deep the roots were. She only knew that when she had first seen the kiss, something had shifted in her marrow. Filing for divorce had been the outward expression of that shift. The photograph, the hard drive, the ledger with Wayne Hill's name. These were the instruments she would use to pry open a family empire that had looked for years like unassailable stone. Night came on the city with a damp metallic hush. Lily sat by the window with the photograph on the table before her, and she thought of the man in the grey tie, of a party where drinks were tamped down and a line in an invoice that read like a signature. The economy of truth is cruel and precise. To find it, she had to learn to be cruel and precise in return. She turned off the lamp and, like a ritual, slid the photograph back into her coat. Tomorrow the work would begin again. The thread of the Hayes Empire would be tugged. Whether it would unravel or coil tighter around her throat was a thing she could not know. For now, there was only the momentum of a woman who had seen the kiss and, because she had seen it, decided that nothing about the life she had known would be the same. Morning came brittle and thin, the city washed in a flat, embarrassed light. Lily woke with the photograph heavy against her ribs as if it had become part of her. She moved through the rituals of the day with a steadiness that surprised her. Coffee, a quick call to Maria, a list of next steps scrawled on the back of an old invoice. The hard drive hummed in an evidence bag on her dining table. Its plastic wrapper made a tiny crinkle every time she touched the corner. It was not proof that would scream guilt in a court. It was a map of small truths that, when stitched together, might point to the people who had made certain tragedies easy to accept. Maria had worked all night. She'd pulled timestamps, matched event logs against server backups, and most crucially, traced an outgoing call pattern on a number listed in one of the invoices. The number had pinged towers near the harbor the night of the gala 3 years ago. It had pinged again the night Lily's father had driven home. The same number flashed in recent months, often around times when Adeline appeared with Ethan. Maria's voice-over speaker was cool and precise, the voice of a person with telescopes for patience. "It's not a smoking gun," she said, "but it's a trail." "Whose number is it?" Lily asked. "Wayne Hill's, or at least a burner that routes through him. There are payments that line up with that contact. There's also a recurring transfer to a shell company tied to Julian Hayes. Same shell Julian used for a storage unit, the one that had your hard drive. Julian's fingerprints are on a lot of paper that looks like bookkeeping mistakes, but lines up in ways that feel deliberate." A few hours later, Maria handed Lily a printout that felt more like a charge than a piece of paper. A call log where a short sequence of numbers, burner to burner, linked the gray tie man's time at the harbor to a motel room charged the same night, to a payment labeled security consulting 2 days later. The last entry on the sheet was a line that read, in a way Lily would memorize, "Transfer to W. Hill, ref, contingency." The world narrowed. If Wayne Hill had been paid to be at the harbor, if a man with a gray tie had been near the bar when someone said they saw a drink tampered with, then the accident that killed her father could no longer be a random misfortune. It had to be re-examined. It would take time, and the police, to overturn a public narrative. But time, Lily now understood, also had a currency, momentary advantage. She had to press something into the present, something that forced watchers to blink. She took the files to the producer who had told her to be methodical. Together they arranged for a secure reveal to a journalist they trusted, but even before a story could run, something else happened. The pattern of threats intensified. Julian's tone in voicemails grew thinly edged. An unnamed account posted her address with a mocking emoji. A shadow followed her across 2 blocks while she tried to pick up a parcel. The city made its displeasure known to women who peeled back the curtain. Ethan called at odd hours with voices that alternated between pleading and quiet anger. He insisted again, insisted that the family could be contained, that Julian could be managed if they simply held steady. "We have to think 3 moves ahead," he told her once, as if chess could solve the moral calculus of a life. Publicly, privately, legally. The words felt like sandbags he used to shore up things he did not want to fall. "You're dodging," Lily said. "You told me once you loved me because I asked the hard questions. Now you ask me to stop asking." His silence was long. "I'm trying to protect what remains," he said finally. "Grandfather, the foundation, the employees." "You're protecting people who might have done this to my father," she answered. "You can't put that on a ledger." He did not reply. Weeks morphed into a pattern of small victories and greater risks. Marco dug up an intern who remembered Julian pressing to handle certain footage. Sean found a taxi driver who remembered a hand on a knee in the back seat, and that driver's license plate matched a car Julian's assistant had been seen using. Maria traced a payment trail from a shell company to a motel in the days after the harbor gala. The evidence was not neat. It was not authoritative. But it was enough to force movement among people who thought motionlessness kept them safe. Then the plan Julian had been feeding forward reached a dangerous temperature. The charity auction that had been rescheduled in the wake of the previous disruption was to be the last public event before the Hayes birthday memorial. Adeline was listed as a guest speaker. Lily had been warned off, threatened with injunctions, told that her presence would be detrimental. She went anyway. If someone was going to stage things, she wanted to be where it would matter most. The ballroom at the new venue was a cathedral of sheen. Crystal chandelier light traced the gowns and tuxedos, throwing ribbons of gold that momentarily made the room look safe. Cameras were out in force. Julian's people were there like a small dark current. Ethan stood at the head table, hands steadied on the lectern, practicing pity in the right places. Everything felt like a pause. Halfway through the speeches, a man burst from the crowd and made for the stage. Security reacted, but not swiftly enough. The man reached Adeline as she stepped away from the microphone. He grabbed her arm with a roughness that stopped cameras and conversations at once. In the time between the grab and the room's collective gasp, 2 other figures slipped behind a service door. The man at the microphone barked into a phone with a voice Lily heard as the voice of an enforcer. He said, "We have her. Move now." People froze. There was confusion, then panic. Chairs scraped. Phones were raised. Ethan's face turned a coppery crucible of decisions. He moved toward the stage. From where Lily stood, she watched the scene as if from deep water. Her first instinct was not fear but calculation. Who was the man who had grabbed Adeline? Why did 2 aides slip away so smoothly? Why had a second security team hesitated? The pattern, payments, logs, men with neutral faces, repeated itself in the space of a minute and lit up for her like a signal. Someone in the crowd filmed the abduction. The video streamed to social feeds within seconds. Kidnapping at Hayes Gala trended in a stunned instant. Ethan pushed through the crowd, hands outstretched, eyes hunting for his wife. He stopped at Adeline, who was frozen, not out of shock but recognition. They were seized by men who had rehearsed the move. "Let her go," Lily yelled, and the words seemed both small and huge. People pointed. The attackers, 3 of them, moved quickly, carrying Adeline toward a service exit. A van idled outside, black and plain. The driver, a man in a baseball cap, kept his face away from the cameras. The whole thing was fast and clumsy in a way that suggested it had been meant to be a terror, not a precision operation. Ethan faced them. He could have followed. He could have prioritized his wife, the family, the company. Cameras flashed. The man in the cap looked up and through the glare, and for a second he held Ethan's gaze. Ethan looked at Adeline, then at Lily, then back at Adeline. He hesitated. Lily had expected many things, that he might be cowardly, that he might be protective, that he might be deeply strategic. The hesitation was a seesaw she felt in her gut. In that fraction of a heartbeat, he made a choice. Ethan pushed past the crowd toward Adeline. He went after her. He moved with the kind of single-mindedness that made people who worked with him say the word leader. He was fast, and he was sure of himself. For Lily, watching Ethan move like that felt like watching 2 different men collide. One who had once held her hand while they planned a life, and another who instinctively guarded an asset. He reached the van, and a scuffle began. In the crush of bodies and the glare of lights, someone pushed him back. A guard was struck. Someone shouted that Ethan had been pulled into the van by an attacker, then thrown out, his suit muddied. The van pulled away, tires barking for distance. Adeline was gone. For a moment, everything felt unmade. There were screams and sirens and the staccato voice of a coordinator yelling for cameras to cut away. Then the feeds turned to the broken shape of what had just happened. A CEO, splattered and furious. An empty patch on the pavement where a woman had been lifted like a blot on a page. Within an hour, rumors began to form their own structure. Some said Julian had orchestrated the abduction to force Ethan into making a choice. Prove his loyalty to Adeline and destabilize his marriage, or abandon her and provide fodder for Julian to step in with offers of steadiness. Others whispered that Wayne Hill had been paid to make it look like a kidnapping, an extortion stunt gone wrong. People like stories with cause and villains. The press, rational or ravenous, was hungry for a line. Lily did not wait for stories. She found a man in a maintenance uniform who had been near the exit. He gave her a detail with a small, accidental clarity. As the van left, he heard a call from a burner phone that said, "Move to the south lot, no cops." It was enough. It was a breadcrumb she could follow. She called Maria. Maria called in favors to a friend in the transit authority and to a tech who could triangulate the van's path from the grainy video. Phones rang like bell signals. Someone recognized the van's profile from a surveillance camera on a side street, a loop that had been stored in a private disk. The disk, Maria said, had been backed up to a cloud account tied to a different shell company. The cloud account bore an email address that, when cross-referenced with Julian's assistant, produced a match. They had a hot trail. The hunt became raw and immediate. Police assigned to the case leaned in because politicians leaned in when a Hayes event turned violent. Ethan's public face was intact enough for the city to treat the abduction as a criminal act rather than a spectacle. The van had been traced. A corner of an industrial lot outside town yielded an empty bundle of clothes, a bottle of water, and a piece of fabric with a manufacturer's tag that traced back to a boutique where Julian's assistant had bought suits. The men who had seized Adeline were tracked to a warehouse. Maria and Lily and a police squad arrived on the periphery. There was no cinematic showdown. There was shouting, a 2-hour siege, and then the careful unraveling of hands that had been given orders. One of the kidnappers had a phone that rang with a caller ID labeled Julian. It was a cheap hand-me-down, not a burner clean of fingerprints. The call records on that phone matched the call pattern Maria had been following, a string of short dials to a number that routed to Wayne Hill. They found Adeline in a room beneath a warehouse, awake, pale and responsive. She was frightened, and when she saw Lily, she did not look like a woman who had been an aggressor in others' stories. She looked like a person who had been used. Lily held her hand because there was nowhere else for a human to go in a moment like that. Police officers cuffed 3 men. Wayne Hill's name came up in interrogation. One of the arrested men, smaller, astonished, began to talk. He had been paid. He had been told they were collecting a debt. He named Julian in a way that made Lily's blood run hot and brittle. Julian said it had to be dramatic, he said. He said it would make Ethan look like he'd pick sides. Julian's intention, however cynical, overshot. The backlash was a public thing. The feeds filled with images of Ethan grappling with men on a van, while Adeline's face blinked in frames too close to be private. Ethan's choice, he had chosen to chase Adeline, was framed as both devotion and complicity. The optics were a wound. The board of Hayes Group convened in hours, not days. Investors noticed. Commentators parsed motives. And yet the legal thread that mattered was what the arrested men were saying. Someone had issued payments, someone had coordinated the van, the interrogation transcripts mentioned invoices. The invoices pointed to Julian's shell company. The hard drive added the rest. Emails, calendar entries, and one voice memo, where an assistant, exasperated and hushed, described a night when Julian told her to dispose of an embarrassing clip. It was not a confession of murder. It was, however, an anatomy of cover-up. Julian responded in the way men like him do, with a press release that read like a performance of innocence. He retained lawyers who wrote statements about unrelated philanthropic commitments and dashed out an interview where he appeared calm beside stock footage of a hospital wing. He posted photographs of himself cutting a ribbon at a community center. His face in those images had the polished smugness of someone who believed narrative could deflect consequence. But in the private rooms of the Hayes family, the calculus shifted. Grandfather Hayes, already fragile, decompensated the week after the abduction. Doctors called it a decline, accelerated by stress. Lily spent long afternoons by his bed answering nurses' questions and reading him lines from plays he had once liked. He did not talk much. When he did, his words were brittle and full of the currency of old men, legacy, responsibility, the impossible shape of family decisions. One afternoon he reached for Lily's hand and said, "We wanted to be remembered as builders." He shut his eyes as if the memory of construction hurt. When he died, it was quietly, the way some families do when the world becomes too much. Newspapers noted the passing and then the inquest notes. Grandfather Hayes's death in the context of a family scandal formed their own paragraphs. Ethan stood at the funeral with the steadiness of a man holding something brittle together, but the arc of his control had a visible rent in it. The board called for meetings that involved legal counsel and crisis managers, and, in a small, terrible punctuation, a vote about his continuing role as CEO. Lily watched the collapse with a kind of shocked distance and a strange clarity. The thing she had started to want, to find truth, was happening, but the cost was not abstract. People were scared. There were arrests. There were men in custody who had families. There were whispers that a man named Wayne Hill had been responsible for other unsavory acts that now entered the public record. Adeline, who had been the axis of much of the scandal, was unwell. The police reported that when they rescued her, she had been sedated and terrified. In a later news cycle, it emerged that she had attempted to harm herself in a private moment, an act reported with the cautious, terrified language institutions use to describe someone in crisis. She was admitted to a psychiatric facility for evaluation, not as a villain, but as a person in need of care. The papers ran the headlines anyway. Actress unravels amid Hayes scandal. The narrative that had begun with a kiss had turned into a thicket of consequences. The city wanted names to pin on a board as if doing so would return them to the safety of categories. Julian's shell companies were investigated by prosecution teams who smelled white-collar rot. Wayne Hill and 2 accomplices were held without bail on the strength of the evidence that had been collected and the confessions that the men, scared and pressured, had given. Julian's phone records were subpoenaed. The hard drive's emails were used to support probable cause for search warrants. Ethan's reaction to all of this swung like a pendulum. For the first time in the months since the kiss, he was not only a man who negotiated perception, but a man under indictment of his own choices. In private, he admitted things to Lily, half confessions that fell like wet leaves. He had routed payments through certain accounts. He had told people to keep things from spinning. He had written emails he had convinced himself were for damage control. He did not say he'd ordered anything violent, and Lily did not want to put words into his mouth where she did not have evidence. But his efforts to protect Adeline had been public. Investors called. The board voted. A shareholder motion demanded an independent review. Ethan was asked to step aside pending that investigation. He did, because he understood that the image of a man clinging to power while his company bled was worse than the reality of stepping down temporarily. He signed a resignation letter that read like a man cutting the last fine thread that held his public life in place. Julian's downfall was slower and theatrical in a different way. He had for years built a network of favors and small crimes hidden under the language of philanthropy. The hard drive exposed a ledger line that money had flowed from a foundation to a private security firm. Emails that had once looked like banal memo management now looked like direction. Julian's smugness, the thing that had been his armor, was a fragile shell. Prosecutors found enough to arrest him on charges related to conspiracy to commit kidnapping and related white-collar offenses. The cameras caught him in handcuffs, looking smaller than he had ever appeared in family photographs. He was taken away to a courthouse with a dignity in public. Inside, reporters circled like scavengers. The courts would take their time. There were motions, hearings, and the careful, maddening work of lawyers on both sides. Indictments named people. Julian pleaded not guilty in the first hearing. His lawyers promised to fight. Wayne Hill and others awaited adjudication. Adeline's status complicated matters further. As a person in care, her statements were handled with layers of legal and medical privacy. The narrative that made for clickbait, lover protects lover, CEO's empire collapses, was also the story of very real people in very messy legal and human processes. Throughout it all, Lily refused to be either a martyr or a headline. She testified when asked, telling the truth of what she had seen and what she had uncovered without dramatic claims she could not back. She handed over the items she had collected. She let the investigators take what they needed. She felt sometimes like a witness to her own life, watching evidence line itself up like chalk marks on a wall. She slept badly, waking to images of the balcony and to the question that had driven her this far. How many small erasures had been made in other people's lives? There were confrontations that stung. Ethan asked her once, in a voice that trembled with both regret and calculation, whether she would stand with him through the trial, through the press, through the slow erosion of what remained of his public life. "We are still a family," he said, as if repetition might conjure something that had been undone. Lily looked at him and saw both the man she had loved and the architect of a system that had taught people to value image over life. "I don't hate you," she said. "I can't undo what's been done, but I will not be your cover. I will not be anyone's." He begged, he promised, he flailed with apologies that sometimes felt too neat to be honest. She listened, and she refused. Her agency was hard-won. tempered by the knowledge that walking away would hurt people and by the conviction that remaining would turn her into someone else's armor. And then a small, brutal thing happened that sealed the public perception. A leaked audio surfaced, an assistant's recording that captured Julian's voice arranging details, the tone bored and rehearsed. In it, the assistant read names and dates and Julian's dry reply, "Make sure it's convincing, no body, no blood, just the terrible optic." The clip was short, but it had everything journalistically: motive, voice, banality. It was a relief to some people and a horror to others. For Lily, it was vindication flavored with sorrow. The clip forced even the most cautious of Julian's defenders to distance themselves. Adeline's name carried two realities: the woman who had been used to advance someone's goals, and the public figure who had cultivated a persona that the markets rewarded. As she moved through care, petitions circulated, some calling for accountability, some asking the public to stop treating her as a villain. The complexity of her existence made the headlines uneasy. In court and in hospital rooms, the question of culpability and manipulation would be litigated with both law and medicine at the table. For the press, simple narratives won more share than complex truths. When the board moved to restructure Hayes Group, the company's stock took a hit no recovery plan could immediately staunch. Contracts were paused. High-profile donors asked for audits. Employees whispered. The Empire's scaffolding, once confident and unassailable, had become a site of leaks. In the private rooms of the Hayes estate, the social rituals rearranged. People stopped sitting in the same chairs at the same tables. Friends and allies shifted allegiance like chairs in a house with termites, quick and necessary and small. Ethan offered up a final plea in a moment he thought would make a difference. "We can rebuild this," he told Lily once, fingers cup-sharp around a paper cup of coffee. "We can make it right." She considered his words the way one considers a bridge that could hold when the water is high. She also weighed them against the ledger lines and the dead man's absence at the harbor 3 years ago, against the Polaroid taped to an auction seat, against the men who had been paid to make people disappear into the back of a van. There was a ledger of harm she could not ignore. "I will not be the thing that rebuilds what cost someone his life," she said. "If rebuilding requires me to be silent about that, then I will not help." In the months that followed, public life carved itself into parts. Legal hearings, quiet days with grandfather's will being read, and private efforts to assist those who had been hurt. Lily worked with a small nonprofit that offered counseling to victims of crimes of the sort that had become part of the Hayes narrative. She gave money quietly where it mattered. She kept her name out of most columns, letting the court do the work of adjudication. When Julian was arraigned on more substantive charges, the camera crews were there. He looked, in those shots, like a man stripped of theater. For a family used to glamour, a courthouse is merciless. Julian's arrest did not erase the harm. It did, however, change the tenor of the argument. Wayne Hill and his men faced the criminal justice system. Prosecutors built a case that connected the money to the acts. The hearings were long. The discovery was messy. But the arc of exposure continued. Adeline, as she left the hospital eventually to await proceedings, did not walk back into the life she had before. Her career was damaged, her public persona fractured, and in rooms where she once received applause, there was now a complex mixture of pity and resentment. The law would decide her involvement, and medical professionals would assess her capacity to participate in prosecution. For Lily, the woman whose discovery had set everything in motion, the moral relief of seeing Julian and Wayne Hill answerable was tempered by the slow wear of months of fear and the grief of a man who would not come back. There was a final quiet reckoning in which Ethan faced both boardrooms and family rooms and found his role diminished. He stepped away from the Hayes Group leadership amid protests from some shareholders and relief from others. The empire he had cultivated was not reduced to ash in a day. It was, more realistically, hollowed out by scandal and governance changes. He was left with his name and the paper trail of his choices. Where once he had been the image man who could turn narrative like a hand on a wheel, he now had to live with the consequences of having chosen certain protections over others. Lily did not watch Ethan's decline with glee. There was a steadier, clearer thing inside her. The knowledge that truth had been sought, and that her investigation had forced accountability where before there had been smoothing and cover-ups. She was scarred by what she had learned and by the human cost of exposure. She had lost friends, encountered threats, and seen people she cared about hurt. But she had also recovered pieces of a life that felt honest to her. In the weeks after the main arrests and the first motions, Lily packed a small bag. There was no dramatic burning of photographs, no cinematic spattering of ash. She folded the photograph of Ethan and Adeline into a letter and slipped it into an envelope. The envelope went into a drawer. She left the house with a single suitcase, tax documents in order, and a small sum she had set aside in an account in her own name. The city looked the same, but the light on the street had a different edge. Before she left, she visited the graveside where her father had been laid. The plot was neat, a rectangle of earth, the stone flat and weathered already by seasons. She placed a hand on the cool stone and spoke a few private words. No elegy for what was lost to scandal, no triumph at being vindicated, merely a recognition that a life had mattered and that she had finally stopped letting other people decide what that life meant. Ethan reached out to her the night before she left. He had been sober in his request, rough with grief. "I wish I had acted differently," he said into the phone, the sentence a small stone of apology. "I wish I'd been braver." Lily listened. After a long silence, she said, "Maybe. I don't know if apology is enough, but I do know this. I'm not staying to be saved. I'm leaving to live." She walked away from the haze world in the brittle morning, and in that walk was no theatrical flourish, only the matter-of-fact of a woman choosing motion over stasis. She took a train to the airport and a plane that crossed into a country where people did not know her name. The photograph stayed in the drawer closed. The final public chapters unfolded without her. Courts deliberated, evidence built, and was contested. Julian's path through the justice system would be long and complicated. Wayne Hill awaited sentencing. Adeline's eventual testimony, fragile, mediated, and conducted with legal protections, would be used as part of a case that hinged on whether coercion and manipulation had a legal bearing on criminal acts. The Hayes Group hired a new chair, and the company, bruised, began the slow bureaucratic process of rebuilding governance and intent. Lily's exit was not a victory lap. It was an act of self-preservation and an assertion of a life not to be traded in the public bazaar of scandal. She did not seek to erase what she had started. She kept in touch with Maria and with Sean. She gave a quiet packet of documents to the prosecutors and trusted them to do the legal work she could not. She found, in a small coastal town far from boardrooms, a narrow apartment with a kitchen that let light in at odd angles. She learned to make coffee that tasted like compromise, to read without an agenda, to listen to music that did not demand narrative. The city behind her dealt with the aftermath the way great centers of power do, slowly and with 1,000 small, careful mitigations. There were op-eds that argued she had ruined lives. There were other essays that called the exposure courage. The world no longer saw Ethan Hayes as unassailable. It had, through her actions, learned that perfect lives have seams, and that sometimes those seams are repaired at the cost of truth. On an early morning, months after she had left, Lily stood on a balcony that looked over water that moved in indifferent tides. She unfolded a letter from a friend and watched the sun pull lines across the surface. Her phone buzzed with the sort of small notices life sends. A message from a former colleague offering a project, a headline announcing a new development in the case, a photograph from Maria of a coffee cup on a rainy street. She did not feel triumphant. She felt tired and ready. When the news came that Julian had been indicted on a broader set of charges, conspiracy, fraud, obstruction, the city made small noises. Ethan gave one last public statement, contrite, composed, the kind of measured regret that reads well in print. Adeline's legal team prepared to negotiate statements made under care. Wayne Hill was scheduled for trial. The legal system would, in time, stitch together narratives that matched evidence. Lily watched the headlines with the distance of someone who had chosen another country for her grief. Her last act before boarding a ferry to a small island where she had rented a cottage for a month was simple. She opened the drawer where the photograph had slept and, instead of burning it or posting it in some symbolic act, she put it into an envelope addressed to a museum of archives she had visited once. an institution that collected artifacts of public life, not to gloat, but so the object would not be used again and again as a weapon in someone else's story. She sealed the envelope, walked to the post office, and dropped it in a box. The photograph would have a new custodian, a place where it could be contextualized rather than weaponized. The ferry moved away from the pier. Lily stood at the rail, hair thinned by wind, the city's silhouette folding into the distance. There was a small, clean line of relief in her chest. She had started by seeing a kiss and filing papers that would change people's lives. The arc of consequence had been wider and harder than she had imagined. People she loved had been hurt. Others had been brought to account. She would carry the memory of her father's absence and the knowledge she had helped bring forth into a quieter life. As the island came into view, she thought of the first line that had set everything in motion. She had seen the kiss. It had been the hinge that opened a door. Now, as the ferry cut through salt air, that hinge felt less like a wound and more like a choice. She had chosen to pull at a thread, to follow evidence, to refuse to be smoothed into a story someone else could market. The decision had left her scarred but not broken. If you found this story compelling and want more deep dives into real-life scandals and dramatic unspooling of power, watch the next video in this series to follow similar stories of exposure and resilience.